Okay, I think we're going here. Welcome, Georgi.
Thanks for inviting me. Glad to be here.
Great that you chose to share some time with us. I really appreciate it. I'm sure a lot of people will also appreciate it.
Yep, I'm looking forward to discussing. We have a lot of stuff to cover, but knowing how important this topic is, especially these days with, problems with pregnant women and their newborn children, despite how much money has been thrown at the problem, I think it will be a very interesting topic to your listeners.
I love it. Yeah, and on a personal standpoint, my wife and I have a 2.5-year-old, and we might have more kids. I know you have kids, and there's a lot of people who are thinking about having kids or have kids, like you said, and I think it's probably worth diving into, kind of as a focus.
Yeah, absolutely. Nutrition and kids. I mean, I don't know if many more important things than that.
Yeah, right, exactly. All right, so good to have you on. I thought it might be fun before we get going to some questions about your background and why we're doing this, or kind of a little bit more in depth on why we're doing this. It might be fun to hear what you had for breakfast and kind of how your morning's been going.
Yeah, I mean, I typically try to eat eggs every day, and just as I mentioned recently, to me, eggs are a fascinating food, mostly because this is probably the only type of food that we have in our food supply, we as humans, that is capable of regenerating a complete living organism. So, just maybe a primitive thought on my end, but I thought that must be that little egg must contain a fairly complete set of nutrients required for the flourishing of life, right? Because the chicken that comes out of the egg, it hatches without getting any nutrients from the outside. So I try to eat eggs on a regular basis. So I had 3 eggs today, and basically they were scrambled eggs and put on like 2 slices of white bread with butter, and then there were eggs, fried eggs in butter, a slice of ham, and some pepper jack cheese. There is a coffee shop not far from where I live. It's called Pete's. I think they're actually originally from Berkeley, California.
Yeah, I think so.
It's called Pete's Coffee Shop. Yeah.
Yep.
So they have some pretty good breakfast items, and they actually make a point that most of their stuff is cooked the old school. I think they only use butter, and you can taste it because when stuff is cooked with vegetable oil, it's a very different taste. You start smelling either burned or rancid fat, and I'm fairly sensitive now that I've been avoiding the omega 3 and 6 for several years. You'll be amazed how sensitive you become to these fats. They just don't taste or smell good anymore. And these sandwiches that Pete makes are, they do smell and taste like butter. So and I also had like half a quart of orange juice, which they also sell as well. It's freshly squeezed. So that's my breakfast. Other days I do dairy and orange juice. Some other days I may do like a banana and a concentrated milk protein shake, or casein protein shake. I try not to do these very often, even though the protein is fairly pure, because it's still a synthetically isolated protein, and you can never be completely sure what other excipients are in there. The industrial process uses acid to hydrolyze the protein, and whatever remnants of the acid are there can cause allergic reactions and irritation of the GI tract, which are never a good thing.
Right.
But yeah, overall, my breakfast is fairly typical. But by typical I mean something that your grandma or grandpa would eat, 50 to 100 years ago. So yeah, and after 9 or 10 o'clock, basically it's work, and work continues until 7 or 8 p.m. And that's pretty much it for 6 days of the week.
Awesome. Thanks for that. It certainly sounds like you're providing your body with a lot of fuel.
Yes.
To
Calorie
go through the
dense,
day.
calorie dense, and easily digestible food. I do everything possible to not give my organism food that would arrive to the colon undigested and start feeding the bacteria there and create endotoxin, which will be a topic I'm sure we'll cover later
Yep.
on, because it's very important in pregnancy and for the newborn as well.
Awesome. Yeah. Okay. Thanks for that. Can you briefly go into your background and maybe just as part of that, tell us why you're probably a great person to listen to about this stuff?
So my academic background is actually computer science and math, similar to yours. But when I was about to graduate in 2002 from college, it was just basically we were in the middle of the dot-com crash. and companies were wouldn't touch somebody with a computer science degree with a 10 football. So I had a really hard time finding a job as as an about to be computer science graduate. So I started an internship, which was almost full time, at a biochemical research outfit that was on the premises of the university. My alma mater is Georgetown University in DC. So I was doing IT work for them, and there weren't many IT people in the organization. The entire organization was maybe about 50 people, and of those, maybe four were IT, were basically coders, and the remaining 40 plus were all either doctors or biochemists or biologists or physiologists. A lot of them had MD degrees. A lot of them actually had double MD/PhD degrees. Really, really educated people. And of course, they after work they would go to happy hours. They would hang out. During that work, they'll go to lunch. They'll discuss all these topics. And of course, they weren't talking about IT. They were talking about their fields. And I would tag along, and I was interested in what they had to say.
Sure.
But I kind of felt a bit of an outcast because I wasn't a biochemist person. But they
Yeah.
were nice. They said, yeah, no, just keep coming to our seminars. You all sound like gibberish initially, but little by little. So think about it. A child is capable of learning a language perfectly without getting any outside instruction. All you had to do is be present and listen. And
Yeah.
little by little, things start making sense. You start putting two and two together, and that's how it really works with really any occupation of the mind. And I know now we have 1,000 of them, and we separate them into separate classes of sciences and humanities and arts and whatnot. But
Right.
really, all it comes down to is basically a focused effort of the mind and the ability to have an open mind and learn instead of questioning and arguing all the time.
Yeah.
Um, it's kind of like a child. Basically, sit there, don't talk too much, don't
Yeah.
argue too much, keep an open mind, and maybe you'll learn something. So
And
I
and it was fun for you
yeah,
to do
exactly,
that, right? So
exactly.
that was part of it.
It was so new. It was so new,
Yeah.
and it was fascinating. And when you're not an expert, you tend to like kind of suppress your voice that says, "No, this can't be." So it's really like this. I guess we do live in a culture where we're being stimulated to argue with everybody and everything, and to prove that we are the right ones, and then somebody else is wrong. Well, unfortunately, that's not how that environment is very toxic to science. Science builds on collaboration. Science builds on open-mindedness. Science builds on suppressing this initial urge to prove myself right at the expense of the other person being wrong. So, and me being such a novice in this field back in 2002, I basically, I spent a full year listening to these people without saying a word. And then, then in 2003, I graduated. Then I started working for them full time. And then I said, okay, so this sounds pretty interesting. I'm starting to pick up some stuff here, and it doesn't sound like complete gibberish now, almost like complete gibberish. So what is it that I can do to learn more? And they said, you don't need to go to school. Most of the stuff is now online. You can get, and that was 2003. The internet was, it was fairly nascent. It wasn't as developed as it is now.
Yeah.
And even back, you could find most of the books that you would need to learn biochemistry. You can already find them online in PDF formats. So, they said, well, there are many books, but we like this one. So why don't you go and read this one? So I read one of those books.
Yeah.
And then, they said, well, keep attending the seminars, right? They're all about reports on experimental work. And then, another year passed by. And then in 2004, they basically said, well, look, 2 years of learning the basics should be enough for you to now pretty much understand what we are talking about. You may not understand the minute details of how exactly we did the things that we did, but you should be able to understand what we're trying to say. In other words, we gave these rats this compound. It's supposed to work on such and such enzyme, and then these are the results. It worked or it didn't, and this is how well it worked. These are the side effects, etc., etc. So that was
Got it.
true. But they said, well, look, going forward, it's all about accumulating new knowledge in the form of reading other people's reports, and ideally doing your own. But for that, you need lab space. You need funding. And they weren't shy to tell me that they thought that this was a pretty dirty business. They said, it's not very different from running your own company. If you are a part of a lab, you will be under tremendous stress. You have to publish or perish is the famous saying in the academia. So academia is
Publish or
run pretty much like a business,
publish or peril, you said, right?
or perish or
Oh, yeah. Okay.
perish. So so in other words, so in academia, they have this metric of how well you perform. I guess in the business world is how much money you make for your company, right? And if you're making more than they're paying you as a salary, I guess the rationale is you're going to stay as an employee, right? But they're going to try to increase that gap. Like you make as much as they can squeeze out of you, and they pay you as little as they can. Well, the same paradigm is true in academia, in the lab space at least. So you go work for a lab, and you basically have to do a lot of work for the person. They're usually called principal investigators. They're like older, respected scientists that have a lot of pull with the government or private industry from where the funding comes. And they get like, every year they have to write proposals and propose new things to work on. And then they either get the money from the government and or private industry, or they don't. And as a result of the work that's being done in these labs, then they're expected to publish something like a study in a journal, right? So it's really like, unless you are the principal investigator yourself or very close to the top, you're essentially like a slave, a lab rat. They call you a lab rat, and there's a running joke among people who work in labs that the rats are getting treated than the human lab rats, because at least the lab rats, the actual rats, they're important because they cost money. You need to feed them. You need to take care of them, because otherwise the experiment is not going to go well. While a human lab rat, you can dispose of anytime you want, and not much will change. Anyways, they were half joking about that. So anyway, their advice was strongly against changing jobs and going into the academia and doing biochemistry work. It's not worth it. You don't have the degree for it, right? I mean, the idea is you're doing this for the knowledge. And these days, nobody's going to pick you up and say, "Oh, this is a bright guy. He's completely self-taught. So let's just not necessarily completely self-taught, but it's not official academic work. You didn't get a degree, right? So without a degree, you will be worse than a lab rat. You'll be doing a lot of work mostly for free, and you will not get any credit. They won't even put your name on a publication. So that's a pretty strong discouragement, if you ask me. So I said, well, then what do I do now? They said, well, look, if you're doing it for the knowledge, you already have the initial skills that you need, the initial knowledge, the lingo, so to speak.
Yeah.
So now on, it's all you. It's all you. So what do I do? Okay, well, you go to PubMed, which is the government-maintained library. Actually, I worked at PubMed in 2004 as an IT security contractor.
Okay.
So after I ended my job with these guys in 2004, I started at work with a local IT security company. It was a tiny company. I was their first hired employee. Before that, it was just the two founders. And then the first contract that they had, that company did and still does mostly work for the government as a contract. So the first contract that they got, on which I was put on to work, was as an IT security specialist at NIH, National Institutes of Health. And most of the people that worked at that Biochemical Research Foundation, NIH is not far off. It's maybe like 3 miles north of Washington, D.C. It's part of the Department of Health and Human Services. And National Institutes of Health, NIH, is not perhaps, it is the biggest biochemical research institution in the world. They have, I don't know how many hundreds of billions of dollars annually just distributed among various labs to do work on a number of different biochemical projects. So most of these 40 plus people that worked at the biochemical outfit, nonprofit that was at the university, they had joint positions at NIH or pharma companies or some universities, et cetera, et cetera. So I was basically, I had my first job was as an IT security specialist at NIH. So first of all, I saw firsthand how lab rats are getting treated. So the people are advising me not to go into academia without a degree. And even though I even saw how some people with degrees are getting treated, like it wasn't good. Worked on a project that exposed me to the National Library of Medicine, which is a subdivision of NIH, and they're the ones who maintain this database called PubMed. And this is the largest medical database in the world. In every study that's published in a United States or Western European journal will get put into the database as well. And they also get journals from other parts of the world as well, but they're limiting the influx. They only take from certain journals that they think are reliable, which I guess is not a bad idea. Long story short, you go to PubMed and whatever topic interests you, you search for studies on that topic, and then you start reading. That's all there is to it. Really, you're reading reports on experiments in whatever field, whatever area of biochemistry interests you. So since 2004 up until this day, I've been spending hours, sometimes up to like 6 to 8 hours a day, doing nothing but reading studies. And here I am. So most of my knowledge is based on, aside from the theoretical knowledge, which I've read the same books that most medical students do during the first 2 years of medical school. Um, Basically, most of my other knowledge is from experimental reports on things in the physiology, biochemistry, medical field, oncology, neurology, pretty much everything related to health, but with a special twist on it. In other words, I'm looking at it from the angle of metabolism, of
Mm-hmm.
energy generation, not genetics, not these unique multitude of unique, bizarre diseases that have no known cause, but somehow are suddenly now they're flooding the population. We have no idea what's going on. It's a health crisis, and nobody's willing to explain or even propose an idea of why this is happening. Because genetics shouldn't be able to explain it, unless you believe that in the last 50 years we mutated bizarrely and with extreme speed. So now we're all mutants and all these diseases are coming because of mutations. Then the answer must be environmental.
Yeah.
Something is happening around us all the time, and that something is not good because these negative health changes are accelerating. And some of the people who are affected the most are women who are thinking of becoming pregnant, are pregnant right now, or small children that have just been born. I think you and I had a conversation about the 1,000-day rule.
Mm-hmm.
Even in mainstream medicine, like if you ask people who specialize in obstetrics and gynecology, they'll tell you of the 1,000-day rule. In other words, that they've noticed, and it's not something that's officially codified, but it's a rule of thumb. They've noticed that the health of the child, the health of the adult, is more or less imprinted, determined to a large degree by whatever environment the child was exposed to for the first 1,000 days since conception. So that pretty much means 9 months of pregnancy and in the first 2 years of their life.
Wow.
So whatever environment, especially during pregnancy, the child is very vulnerable. And if the mother's organism is also weakened by various toxins, stressors, etc., and who isn't, right?
Yeah.
That really imprints the child. And then you have, after the child is born, then whatever food you feed that child, if it's fed formula instead of being breastfed, if it's living next to a long-term like these long-distance transformators with these the power lines that generate this massive electric field, if it's living next to a coal plant, like all of these things matter
Yeah.
tremendously. Even though most people will think, oh, well, we were living next to that coal plant for only a year while Bobby was small, and then we moved away. Yeah, but that was the first year of his life, and that's 1/3 of those 1,000 days. So it's really important. Not many people think about that, and
Yeah.
and unfortunately, not many doctors really warn their patients about how important the pregnancy in the first 2 years are.
Which is exactly why I wanted to have you on, so we could talk about those things. I just think it's incredibly valuable to consider that there's so much being done in the womb and then shortly after birth.
That's
Uh,
right.
so I appreciate you saying that. You talked about the metabolic kind of viewpoint on life and health. Can you go into that just a little bit more? And I think a lot of the things we're going to talk about. I think, when you were on with Danny Roddy once, you guys talked about the umbrella of biological energy and that everything kind of falls underneath that umbrella. Can you speak to the standpoint of biological energy a little bit?
Yeah, so basically, there have been two competing theories in regards to health, and most people think there's only one, but there've always been two of them, and they've been competing for dominance since the late 19th century or the early 20th century. So there was one side that thought that everything is predetermined, your health is set, whether you call it genes, whether you call it fate, whether you call it destiny, whether you call it God, whatever you want to call it, that basically how you whatever happens to you in life, it's pretty much it's a done deal, and there isn't much you can do about it. I mean, you can change it a little bit, but you're not going to change the course. You can change, I don't know, the speed. You can change how much you enjoy the ride, but you can't change the course. And then there's the other crowd, the other group, which said no, nature doesn't work like that. Basically, nature likes to incorporate change. And we've seen it in the process of speciation. So two channels, two branches of the evolutionary theory developed. One, which is still the dominant one, says basically progress in evolution happens through random mutations, and they don't depend on you. It doesn't matter what you do, what you don't. Of course, there's some things you can do that can change your DNA directly, like such as ionizing radiation, and there are other mutagens that are known. But we can't really control how they change your DNA. That they're going to mutate it in a random way. So everything about nature to this group was random, right? It's not something that can be controlled. It's not something that can be predicted. It's not something they can really do much about except sit there and live as a passive observer. So they thought that, you live through your life and your health and your life is determined based on the genes that you inherited from your parents. And if there happens to be a mutation in your genome during your lifespan, then if this mutation is beneficial to your survival and reproduction, then this mutation will be carried on to the next generation, and so on and so on. If it's not, then this theory says that ultimately evolution will deselect for you, for your kind, because you've mutated in a non-beneficial way, and the environment doesn't like that specific mutation. And then there's this other group, they're called Lamarckians, after a French scientist called Lamarck, and they said that's not how this works. I mean, everything that the organism is exposed to throughout his or her lifetime, the organism has a way of taking that information and passing it on to the next generation. And the genomists, I'm going to call them the neo-Darwinists, said, no, that's nonsense, it's impossible. We've checked, the genes are the same, there'll be no mutations between like the offspring and the two parents, so no information has been passed on. Of course, but at the time they didn't know that you can pass on information through a non-genomic pathway, which is called now epigenetics.
Mm-hmm.
Long story short, these two groups have all been battling each other. It's the static group, which is the neo-Darwinists. Static, random, you don't have control over it. Once it's set, it's set. If a disease happens, it's because it's in your genes. You have a bad gene, etc., etc. It's not your fault, right? While it's not anybody's fault really, but they're trying to somehow make it, it's not your fault either. And then there's the other group which says no, everything you do matters. Like what the kind of life you live matters. The choices that you make matter. The things that you expose yourself to matter. The people you surround yourself with matter. All these things matter. Not only do they matter to your health, but you also pass them on to your offspring, and so on and so on and so on. So metabolic theory is kind of aligned more with the Lamarckians, because it's dynamic. It says that not only are the things that you're doing during your life mattering, not only do they matter, but also the way you react to your environment, the way you live your life, the kind of human being you are, and the extent to which you develop your potential. It all depends on the amount and the pathway through which you produce energy. So many people that have said this too, it's almost like a light bulb going off. They immediately say, well, that makes perfect sense. Like we all know children are, they're always full of energy. They're rarely cranky unless they're tired, right? And it's very easy for us to admit that a child is cranky because a child is tired. In other words, there's fatigue. There is a lack of energy. But when an adult is cranky, when an adult is having a fit, when an adult is angry, it must be bipolar depression or schizophrenia or God knows what other kind of named condition that, of course, if you ask a psychiatrist, he or she will ultimately say it is in your genes. Well, how come? Why do we have this dichotomy? And metabolic theory says that really there isn't any difference between a child and an adult. The only difference is energetic. With age and due to the environmental stressors that we are exposed to, ultimately our ability of producing energy from food declines. I mean, basically, we're less efficient. So we start converting most of this food into fat instead of carbon dioxide and water, which is the efficient way of metabolizing it. And as we accumulate this fat and as our energy production declines, all hell breaks loose. Now, even a mechanic, when you go to a mechanic and talk to him or her about the kind of gas or oil you use in your car, even they will tell you that even in a device as mechanical as a car, the type of gasoline that you use and the type of oil that you use matters. Because the car is a completely mechanical device, but so the way current medicine views the body is, oh, you're just like the car. So I don't care what kind of fuel you put in, as long as it's fuel and as long as it's burning properly, then it doesn't matter. It shouldn't matter. Like 5 different kinds of fuel are the same from a point of view of the car. What are you buying from Shell or Sonoco or British Petroleum, they're all selling you gas. But the mechanic will say, well, hold on a second. If you use this kind of let's say you're using a diesel fuel in a gasoline car, that's going to wreak havoc, right? Even though it's just a mechanical device, your car is not supposed to run on that. So it is going to cause problems, and sometimes even structural problems. Not just the car won't working, but something will explode, or something will get damaged and it needs to be replaced. Same thing with the oil. So metabolic theory says we're actually a lot more sensitive than a car. Unlike a car that needs its gasoline and oil mostly to propel itself, the human body needs energy not simply to do things, but actually to exist. And this paradigm is known very well in anesthesia, where the way they put you under is they simply interrupt the energetic process in the brain. All anesthetic chemicals are actually fundamentally chemicals that interfere with the synthesis of ATP, the energetic molecule in the brain. That's how they put you under. So
Wow.
we need energy production in order to be alive. And if we need it for such an important process, it wouldn't be too much of a jump to suppose that we probably needed energy for other things, such as maintaining proper bodily structure, maintaining proper health of our organs, maintaining everything. Every effort requires energy in our life, right? It doesn't have to be about health, but why wouldn't it also require about health as well? So let's say you have a mechanism that repairs a wound, right? Well, that takes energy. That there's new tissue that needs to be grown. There's infection that needs to be taken care of, right? Which is in the wound. Then basically you need to, like, if it's a fairly big wound, the body will usually form a scar. All of this new tissue needs to come from somewhere, and all of that takes energy. And all of this energy that we get, it comes from food. So it sounds very plausible that if with aging and exposure to toxin and stressors and whatnot, if our ability to produce energy declines, then it's pretty obvious that our health will decline, because the repair process and it just in general our daily process of just being alive will not go as well, because we just can't muster up the same energetic response, the same energetic process as we did when we were younger, when we were children. Children heal wounds without scars. Children very rarely get depressed. Now that's starting to change lately, which is actually another testament of probably of the declining health of people in general, right? We're going to talk about like the neonatal, and I already mentioned the first 1,000 days. But the overall idea of the metabolic theory is very, very simple. You need energy not just to make you move, but simply to be alive and to just keep going on about your business of being human. And the better you produce energy, the healthier you will be, the more energetic you will feel, the more resilient to disease, trauma, bad events in your life, etc., etc., the more resilient you will be. And conversely, the more energetically dysfunctional you are, the sicker you will be, and the less resilient you'll be to the stressors in your life. And ultimately, you can view life as sort of like a very simple challenge response mechanism. We live in an environment that constantly poses, like basically floods us with signals, so to speak, right? Whether it's looking at a monitor or responding to another human being interacting with you, or like just going and doing grocery shopping. All of these things are things that the environment throws at us, and we have to respond. That response takes energy. And I think many people intuitively already know that a sick person usually tends to be very irritable. They don't want to do things. They don't like change. They don't like novelty. They just want to be left alone. And for them, the entire world is a threat, is an irritant, simply because anything that the world throws at them, they cannot muster up the energetic response and respond properly. Conversely, children are the exact opposite. They love the world. They're always out there, always playing, always enjoying it, right? It all comes down to the efficiency and effectiveness of producing energy from food. And that's the gist of my work and the work of Ray Peat and many other people who are working in the field of flexibility, of malleability, of things constantly changing and interacting with the environment. And our enemies, so to speak, are the neo-Darwinists who think that everything is static, and no matter what you do, you're essentially dead matter floating through the world, existing through time, and waiting for the inevitable end without much choice or say in what happens in between.
Got it. Okay, thank you. So I think what we're going to do in the podcast show here is we're going to put up some studies that you've posted over the last several years, and kind of let listeners or anyone who might view this take listen to your summaries of some of these studies. I'll share the screen in a second here. And then we'll go into some more specific questions about prenatal and neonatal development. But before we get into those studies, I just kind of to wrap this back up and bring it back to pregnancy and neonatal development. Can you just kind of generally encapsulate? I think any woman who's going to give birth or any family who's expecting, they want it to go well.
Right.
So can you just kind of generally summarize what you think a healthy pregnancy might look like, and then later we'll get into more specific questions.
Well, a couple of things. I mean, even before the pregnancy, I would try to make sure that if there are any chemicals, any prescription drugs being used, I would sit down and talk to the doctor, because many of those drugs that are currently labeled as safe for pregnant women or women who are thinking of becoming pregnant, and the same thing applies for males as well, because many of those drugs can damage sperm. And even though the geneticists will tell you, well, it's not a problem, they're not causing mutations, well, it's been shown that at this point conclusively that certain drugs that the father is taking can dramatically and negatively affect the health of the child, even though they're not causing any genetic mutation. So clearly, the Lamarckians are on the right here. So I would first start with the prescription drugs, because they tend to be the strongest toxin that either one of the parents can be taking. So if there are things such as birth control, antidepressants, blood pressure medications, blood sugar lowering medications, these are major classes. Like anti-acid medications are another class of drugs that recently have been catching the news, because many doctors were thought they were completely benign. Anything far, was far from it. Not only they're not benign, but they're turning out to be one of the biggest toxins, because they're so pervasive, because they were thought to be so safe. They were even approved for usage in children as young as 1 year of age. So
Wow.
any of these, the proton pump inhibitors, PPI, these are drugs that are now sold over the counter in your local CVS or Rite Aid. They're the famous names such as Prevacid, Nexium, Pepcid, etc. All of these drugs are all the proton pump inhibitors that turn out to be really dangerous. So any kind of a long-term chronic prescription drug usage needs to be reviewed. And I would go and I'll challenge the doctor to basically start digging, because many times the doctor is busy and he or she will simply give you the official spiel that they get from the FDA, whatever the current research according to the FDA on this drug is. But that's not the current research. If you go to PubMed and search, which is probably another thing your listeners can do, and many of the studies that you've listed already provide the link to PubMed. They just need to go there and enter the name of the drug they're taking, and offer, and then say, like, let's say like a Prilosec space side effects, and that's enough for PubMed to start spitting out a ton of studies published in peer-reviewed journals that are really, they're describing the horror of what these drugs can do. So by law, you're allowed to go to your doctor, show these studies, and demand an answer. Your doctor should not be allowed to walk away and say, no, I don't want to see these. That's what the FDA says. That's the truth. That's not how this works. By law, you are allowed legally to demand an answer. And a good doctor should do it, because if they don't, but yet retain you in their practice, they're exposing themselves legally. So either they should give you an answer or should tell you, I'm not willing to work with you, go find another doctor, right? So eliminating or at least modifying prescription drugs will be the first thing that I would consider. And then second thing I would consider, many women who are about to become pregnant or are already pregnant are being told that exhaustive exercise is really good for them. It's one of the best things you can do. In order to prevent the infamous weight gain after pregnancy, they're being told, well, you should go to the gym. Don't worry, as long as you're not lifting too heavy, these heavy weights, you should be okay. You can run the treadmill for an hour. You can do the bike for an hour. And you can even do like these spinning. They call spinning, I think, it's like soul cycle classes. Like all this is fine. There's nothing wrong with it. Well, not so. Essentially, anytime you do exhaustive exercise, you're compromising the proper production of energy from food. You go into fat burning mode, and the two big things in metabolic theory are, you can derive energy from only two of these sources, fats or glucose. So carbs, any carb you ingest ultimately will get converted and metabolized as glucose, and then the other macronutrient is fat. And protein, you can also burn as energy, but it's not supposed to be burned as energy, because if you do, you're generating a lot of ammonia, which is very toxic. But if you do, protein gets converted to glucose, and that's how it gets metabolized. So the two major macronutrients used for energetic synthesis are glucose and fat. And in metabolic theory, basically says that, initially when we're walking around at a pleasant pace, when we're not overexerting ourselves, when we're having fun, when everything is hunky-dory, peachy, we're burning glucose. We're going from the either whatever we just ate or a few hours ago we ate, or from the glycogen stores in the liver. And glycogen is a long-term storage of sugar, which our organism evolved to develop, and it's stored mostly in the liver. There's some stored in the muscles and even in the brain, but most of it is in the liver. And if we're not overexerting ourselves, this glycogen is usually sufficient for several hours. And then we start to get hungry again, right? And then we're supposed to eat again. Well, currently the advice is you should be starving yourself. You should be restricting your calories, right? You should be going into fat burning mode. Well, evolutionary speaking, burning fat was never a good thing. It was always a signal that the environment is currently hostile. It's not really conducive for good life. And it's not an environment where you want to be bringing a child into this world. It means there's famine, there's war, there's something going on that's preventing the organism from doing its normal physiological for resolving its normal physiological needs, right? There's some kind of a threat that apparently is more important than eating, and that's why you're not eating. You're running away, or you're hiding, or you're doing something else. Well, the oxidation of fat over the billions of years of evolution developed as a very strong signal to our organism that when you're burning fat, you're under stress, things are not going well, and then as such, the body little by little starts to prioritize your survival over the survival and health of other things, such as the baby growing inside the womb, right? So it will take resources away from the baby and give them to the mother because the body knows that if something happens to the mother, the baby's gone too. So it should prioritize the mother. So every time the mother stresses itself, and even it applies even to the father before the pregnancy happens, because, like I said, toxins, bad diet, prescription drugs, any kind of a stressor, it changes. First of all, the fertility, the motility of the sperm, and how easy the pregnancy will happen. And second of all, it imprints on the child that the father was under stress, that the father was in an environment that was not optimal. And all of these signals, the environment constantly incorporates into us, and then they get transferred onto the baby as well. So fatty acid oxidation is a major stress signal, and as you and I discussed several times already, it so far seems to be implicated in virtually every chronic disease that has been tested out there. Whether you have cancer or diabetes or cardiovascular disease or neurological disease or an autoimmune condition like a rheumatoid arthritis, etc., universally, when doctors looked at this, they saw that the oxidation, the metabolism of glucose was suppressed, and then the oxidation of fat was increased. The levels of fatty acids in the blood was increased. And in metabolic theory and in medicine in general, there is this thing called the Randle cycle, which says that at any point in time, the cell can oxidize either glucose or fat. It cannot do both at the same time. Not only that, but these two micronutrients, they suppress each other's oxidation, and they suppress their own, they accelerate their own oxidation. So if you give glucose, more glucose, you're going to suppress fatty acid oxidation. You're also going to accelerate glucose oxidation. And if you give fat as food, mostly fat, you're going to suppress glucose oxidation, and you're going to accelerate fat oxidation. Keeping in mind that oxidation of fat is so far has been seen as universally as a signal of negative things health-wise, and the oxidation of glucose as positive things. Everything that the couple does before conception or after conception should be geared towards limiting the oxidation of fat and promoting the oxidation of glucose. Aside from the toxins that I mentioned, the prescription drugs, like exposing yourself to strong electromagnetic fields, ionizing radiation is a huge no-no. Many doctors will tell you, oh, it's not a big deal. For a pregnant woman, we can, let's say, irradiate the arm. It's not going to harm the fetus because the fetus is down there. Sometimes they'll even give, like, pregnant women x-rays to the chest, because they'll put this lead apron on top of the belly and say, oh, it doesn't matter, like the x-rays never reach there, right? It doesn't work like that. The human organism is a system. Every time you cause damage to, like, even a peripheral tissue, this signal is being sent centrally. The entire organism knows you're in pain. The entire organism knows you have an infection on your finger, and the entire organism musters up resources in order to resolve that problem. So basically, as soon as pregnancy happens, I will do everything possible to limit the major stressors in life, And many of them, unfortunately, are coming from well-intentioned, or at least used to be well-intentioned institutions, like your doctor, like your
Yeah.
OBGYN. You know, sometimes they would want to do like the latest fad, and now pregnancy is kind of becoming a fad too, is doing a 4D ultrasound. So basically it's a video of the baby inside of the womb,
Right.
and they only tend to do it in the last trimester because the baby is fully formed. It doesn't look like an alien, right? You can see it moving, right? So 3D is 4D ultrasound is basically several ultrasounds from various directions. They're taking these two-dimensional images of the baby, and then a computer reconstructs them. It makes them look like a three-dimensional view of the baby, like a hologram almost, right? And because they're taken over time, then you can also see the baby moving. So they call it a 4D ultrasound. Well, guess what? In order to get these multiple images of the baby, you need multiple ultrasounds. And while ultrasound tends to be relatively safe, at least the evidence that we have so far shows that it's safer than clearly than X-rays and even MRIs. All studies so far show that as soon as an ultrasound is basically positioned close to the head of the baby moves away from it. So it's basically kicking and rotating itself and trying to basically move its head as far away from the ultrasound, basically the sensor, as far away from it as possible. So it shows that the baby is not enjoying it. Whatever this ultrasound is causing, maybe it's not causing any damage, but for sure the baby doesn't like it. They did a study where they put inside of the womb of the mother, with permission, of course, they put a receiver, almost like an artificial, and they found out that this ultrasound generates the noise equivalent of a speeding bullet train through a tunnel. That's what the baby hears. So it's not surprising at all that the baby is trying to move away its head from the ultrasound. Yeah. So, but it is one of the safest things you can do. So if the doctor is pushing you to get an extra ultrasound just to be sure, I would advise to seriously consider it, because most of the time you don't need to over medicalize pregnancy. This is a natural process. You
Yeah.
know, despite all of this medicalization of pregnancy, guess what? Western countries continue to have increasing both maternal and fetal mortality, despite throwing more money at this than the rest of the world combined, and more than any previous time in history. And it keeps increasing, right? They keep asking for more money and the latest technology and latest one. Well, maybe there is a diminishing rate of return. Maybe we've long past the peak at which pregnancy needs to be examined slash medicalized. Maybe you just need to make sure the mom is okay, the baby is okay, and I'll see you in 9 months, right? Unless something bad happens. That's how it used to be, and it seemed to work pretty well. So yeah, the big stressors need to be eliminated, and those, if possible, include stress at work, working long hours, working under fluorescent lights is a huge stressor because, as you and I discussed before, blue light is a powerful suppressant of the respiratory enzyme cytochrome C oxidase. So it powerfully inhibits, in simpler terms, blue light and ultraviolet light, and the entire light in the blue slash ultraviolet spectrum section of the spectrum is heavily suppressive of your metabolic ability, so of your ability to convert food into energy. While red light and infrared light, and in general the reddish slash yellow slash orange section of the spectrum of visible light, even green, they're really beneficial, and they activate the respiratory system. They activate the production of energy from food. So again, avoiding long exposure to fluorescent lights, avoiding long hours work in the office, because most offices in buildings are built to minimize the legal exposure to the tenant. In other words, the company, your employer. This means carpets have ridiculously toxic flame retardant chemicals that are known carcinogens, yet the FDA has decided that it's permissible to use them, because otherwise businesses will simply stop hiring people, because even a single fire that kills somebody would mean the company goes bankrupt. So you are knowingly being exposed to a potent carcinogen, and more than one, when you're sitting in an office building, no matter where it is. Some of the older ones, they don't have this many carcinogens in the carpets, but they do have asbestos. So that's the other thing. Like, the older buildings have asbestos, which is another carcinogen, but they don't have the carcinogens in the carpets and in the paint and in the draperies and whatnot. But the newer buildings do. So limiting work in modern or even older office buildings is crucial for a number of reasons. And not the least of which is you won't be surrounded by other stressed, toxic coworkers and bosses. That's what the that's what really the purpose of the corporation is: squeeze out as much money from you as possible and pay you as little as possible. It's
Hmm.
being presented as a communication problem. You need to negotiate your salary better, right? But it's always at the fundamental level. If you're hired labor, the goal is to get, especially if you're salaried, right? Then basically means after, anything that the employer can squeeze out of you on top of the salary is pure profit. So, and they don't particularly care about pregnant women either. Just because you're pregnant, they will not take it easy on you. And in fact, I know many women who are working up until the last week before due to give birth, and some of them have given birth in the office because of the stress, and yet they continue to work. This is really terrible. This is very detrimental to both the mother, the future mother, and the future child. So limiting these things is really important, and there are a number of supplements that can help out if you want to go into that. Not sure if you want to discuss those as well.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, that's just such a great overview, and I have some specific questions maybe later for listeners. You talked about EMF, you talked about blue light, just some specifics later on like what exactly that means and how we can practically avoid things like that. It just my kind of general observation. It doesn't sound easy for someone living in our society to have a healthy and safe pregnancy. And so I
Unless
think
you have
that
a rich spouse, and they can afford to support the pregnant woman while she's at home.
sure. And it does sound doable. And so I guess even
Yeah.
though it's hard, I think there's a silver lining and there's a kind of a ray of hope for people who are going to be bringing humans into this world and kind of for the future of our world. So we'll get into kind of more of that, what we can do specifically. And but I mean, you mentioned you covered so many things, so we might just touch on a few kind of practical examples of some of those ways that pregnant women can really be different. Because it sounds to me too like you can't just a pregnant woman or anyone really can't just do what everyone does. Can't listen to what the doctor says and take it. And some doctors are incredibly kind and incredibly thoughtful, but it doesn't mean everything they're saying is the best thing for you. And so it just sounds like we got our work cut out for us.
Yeah, so actually, up until about 20 years ago, doctors had a lot of freedom in how they treated their patients. And that's how medicine is really supposed to work. Let's say there's a certain doctor who worked for 50 years with a local community. He or she has seen the local diseases, what tends to happen more often, what tends to hit this region more, what helps, what doesn't, etc., etc. So the doctor can tailor the recommendations. That there will truly be like recommendations that are targeted to the specific context of the people living there, and the specific times, the specific requirements. So basically about 20 years ago, the FDA sort of sent these guidelines to the local medical boards that license all the doctors at the state level, and they basically said enough of this, right? We don't want any more caveman level medicine. We don't want these people like these herbalists, shamans, voodoo magic people and whatnot. We don't want them running around and confusing people with their unscientific recommendations. And there was some of that to the FDA's credit, but the FDA very wisely used this minority of truly charlatan voices and imposed on the state boards. It was issued as a recommendation, but most of the state boards view recommendations from FDA as pretty much God's word, and they go by them. So they instituted at the local level, the state level, they instituted these rules, and they basically said, going forward, the recommendations from a doctor to the patient should be 100% compliant with what the FDA is saying at the federal level. So you kind of standardized medicine against the will of all of these doctors, against their own experience, against the experience of somebody working. Let's say FDA says you should apply sunscreen, SP factor 30 plus, such a layer, this, to this person, and this is a blind recommendation, and some doctor living up in the Arctic Circle in Alaska will say that's nonsense. We don't need it here. This specific one doesn't work. I want to use another one. Well, guess what? If you want to prevent yourself from getting sued into oblivion, that's really a huge thing for doctors and any professional services out there. The legal liability is the number one detractor for the business. the number one threat to a business. So the doctors it has been drilled into their head in medical school is that you do not do anything that exposes your employer or your own private practice to lawsuits. How do you prevent yourself from getting sued, from getting bankrupted by lawsuits? You do the so-called standard of care. It's an actual term. You can Google standard of care. And that's what the FDA creates. The FDA's task at this point, they have a building which is again not far from where I live, about 6 miles further north to like northeast direction in Silver Spring, Maryland. They have an entire task force of about 1,000 people whose job is nothing except creating recommendations / guidelines, cough orders for these doctors all over the country, and they're basically telling these patients, these doctors, how they must be treating their patients. And most doctors are listening because they've learned the hard way that it's not a good idea to defy the FDA.
Sure.
So I'm not saying that the patient shouldn't listen to the doctor. What I'm saying is that many times, actually most of the times, whatever you're hearing coming out of the doctor's mouth is usually not his or her opinion. It's the officially sanctioned dogma that the doctor has simply been scared into regurgitating back to you. So maybe you can catch him, on a more private, in a more private environment, maybe over a drink, maybe if they're a family friend, you can ask them off the record, etc., etc. But in my experience, that even then, these doctors are really scared. They refuse to say things that go against the dogma. But what I'm saying is that you should be challenging your doctor, because if you go to them with evidence, and we are always in my discussion with you or anybody else, we're always basing things on evidence, whether you agree with it or not. Your doctor should be required by law to answer that evidence, or as I said earlier, or tell you you need to find another doctor, right? They don't have time to deal with you. But what you shouldn't be doing is blindly accepting your doctor's recommendations, thinking that they're developed, with the best interest of mind, with the best interest of the patient in mind. That's not how they were created. They were created with the idea to minimize the legal exposure of the medical profession to lawsuits. That is what the job of the FDA is: to protect the medical profession, not protect the patient. Patient is, and I think many people have already realized. I mean, like when you go to a doctor, they ask you to sign the sheet where it says you consent to all of these procedures, to all of these drugs, to whatever it's supposed to be done to you. You fully consent, right? And you're fully absolving your doctor of any responsibility of whatever might go wrong. Yet when you're discussing things with your doctor is not really discussing things with you. Your doctor is kind of ordering you around. They're kind of saying, this is what needs to be done. And and if you try to raise your voice or you try to challenge it, they get really defensive. They even get violent at some point. Yet you're the one accepting the responsibility. Well, you can't have it both ways. If this was a truly well-developed system, they have the doctor sign this. If this is the doctor's opinion that this is the best course of action, have the doctor sign at the bottom that the doctor accepts the responsibility. But that's not how it's done. You at the same time, you're asked to accept full responsibility for somebody else's recommendations and actions. So that should be scary enough for everybody to start really questioning their doctor every step of the way, because you can easily be maimed or killed in a perfectly well-intentioned procedure simply because the doctor doesn't know better or is being told not to stray from the course of standard of care, so to speak.
Sure. Well, it just sounds like, combined with kind of this societal expectation of subservience or kind of just submission. Everyone always says, oh, my doctor said, or
Yep.
that's what they told me to do, and we kind of just it seems like a lot of people, maybe, I don't know, it seems like it would take a lot of strength, and I guess yeah.
So many people are very busy. So many people are very busy, and the system is geared in such a way that you outsource decisions to others, to experts, right? It's not just medicine. We outsource the car repair to a car repair person. We outsource shopping to somebody else. We outsource cleaning to somebody else. So we're so busy with things that it's gotten to the point where, like, the goal of the system, the design of the system is such that you're supposed to focus on your very narrow expertise, whatever that happens to be, and everything else that is not of extremely vital importance to your life, then it gets outsourced. And guess what? Even things that are of vital importance to your life, such as your medical care, at this point are also outsourced. And the message is, you simply don't have the time to go through all this information, and you can't possibly know as much as your doctor does, right? But and while that may be true, the system has been eroded over the last 20 to 30 years, where it used to be that your doctor was a free person capable of making up their own mind of what's good for you and what isn't, and presenting you with options where you choose together, and then you can have an honest conversation with your doctor. These days, if you go to a doctor, a specialist, most of the time you're simply given a plan of treatment. You either agree to that plan of treatment and you sign the disclaimer that you're fully responsible, or the doctor has a huge argument with you, and or you're being told out the door, go find somebody else who is willing to entertain your babbling, your
Sure.
non-professional babbling and discussions. And most people, they don't have the time for this. They don't have the time to shop around for new doctors. They
Yeah.
don't have the time to go and challenge multiple doctors. They probably have a condition that's really scary for them. It's putting a lot of strain on them and their families. And they basically accept their fate and they move on. And that's really terrible.
Yeah.
That's a recipe for disaster, because if the system is not challenged, it will seek the path of least resistance to our detriment, because the system tries to protect itself.
Yeah, I think it's really weird. I mean, I've even felt when I go into a doctor and I want to say something that's maybe different, or bring up something or some idea, or even with our boy, like, hey, we're going to do this and not this, even though you're recommending this, and I've been like nervous. And
Yeah.
I consider myself, and my wife too, like we've been building habits that are a little bit different than other people. I think the mainstream, and we've considered ourselves pretty strong in our behaviors, and we're even like nervous to bring stuff up. So imagine, kind of just that's kind of what we're up against, I guess.
Yeah, yeah, and many other people who are not brought up to challenge their doctor. Everybody's being brought up to respect the doctor. Doctor and teacher, you never touch. Lawyer, you can throw under a car, but doctor and teacher, you never challenge. You never argue with them. You just take their word for granted. It's like gospel, right?
Yeah.
Well, as it turns out, it has been corrupted and eroded, and your doctor is not what he or she used to be 20 to 30 years ago. I'm not even comparing to the doctors from our parents and grandparents' time. Those were different breeds of humans. They weren't even
Sure.
they're not comparable to the ones nowadays.
Sure. And like you said earlier, there might be some out there, and and a listener might have that doctor, he or she, who is someone you can really trust. But
That's
like you
right.
said,
That's right.
it's maybe few and far between.
Yeah, it tend to be smaller towns, like more isolated. If you're getting your medical care from a large institution, chances are they're very heavily corporate minded and legally oriented, and they will do what's best for them and not what's best for you. Those knowledgeable, conscientious, good mannered doctors tend to be individual private practices, typically in smaller towns.
Awesome.
Yeah.
All right. Well, so let me screen share here. I'll bring up a couple of these studies. We'll move on. I'm gonna share the screen. The first one here. I don't know. You'll have to let me know on your end if you can see it. The title is "Aspirin Can Treat Preeclampsia."
Yep. So, as many of your listeners know, preeclampsia and eclampsia is a huge problem nowadays for pregnant women. Many celebrities have struggled with it, and this is what makes it particularly scary and important, in my opinion, because even if those mega ultra super rich people are not capable of improving their health and struggling with this, and it's reaching them, you can imagine how much more exposed we the commoners are. And what happened is that this study showed that even a baby aspirin is really enough to limit inflammation, which apparently plays a central role in preeclampsia and eclampsia, lower blood pressure, lower inflammatory biomarkers, and in general lower the risk for basically like the development of seizures and ultimately like cardiac events that are potentially lethal to both the mother and the child.
Uh,
So something as simple as a single tablet of baby aspirin was enough to have a dramatic positive effect. And even though they're claiming they don't know what the mechanism of action of aspirin is, they're hinting towards inflammation. They're not certain. My personal opinion is that probably one of the biggest benefits of aspirin is that it opposes the effects of estrogen, at the cellular level. And in general, any kind of a condition in a pregnant woman that threatens the fetus first and then the mother tends to be related to estrogen excess and progesterone deficiency. Progesterone is the hormone of pregnancy, and it's usually estrogen excess and progesterone deficiency that cause basically spontaneous abortions without any warning whatsoever. Like, it looked like a healthy pregnancy, and then the fetus was aborted, or seizures in the mom, which depending on the spectrum and the signs of symptoms may be called preeclampsia/eclampsia, or like abnormal fetal heart rate abnormalities seen in the fetus when you go for your monthly ultrasound, etc., etc. So all of these things are known to be related to excessive estrogen and deficiency of progesterone. And aspirin is known to, first of all, inhibit an enzyme that is responsible for the synthesis of estrogen. The enzyme is called aromatase. And aspirin is also known to work at the cellular level on various pathways in a manner that's opposite to that one of estrogen. So estrogen increases free fatty acids. Remember, we discussed free fatty acids being a universal signal of stress, right? Anything stressful is bad for the pregnancy. So aspirin lowers free fatty acids. Aspirin also inhibits the oxidation of fat. And conversely, since we discussed the Rendell cycle in the opposition of glucose and fat, anything that inhibits fatty acid oxidation will increase/improve glucose oxidation. So anything that does that improves the synthesis of carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide has an anti-inflammatory, anti-seizure effect, anti-eclampsia effect. Used to be a common treatment for preeclampsia, but 60 to 70 years ago, up until the mid of the 1950s, basically giving women with preeclampsia to breathe from a hose that the air that contained 5% carbon dioxide was considered standard treatment for preeclampsia. So aspirin, even a small amount of it, apparently does a little bit of all of these various beneficial things that are known to help preeclampsia. And it's really amazing, because if you go to your doctor, if you go to any gynecologist right now and say, "Doctor, I have preeclampsia, how can I treat it?" The answer is you can't. We just have to get you through to the point where the baby is healthy enough so we can take the baby out, and that's the only way. That's the only way forward. We have to take the baby out by the 6th or 7th month. The baby, of course, is going to be in the neonatal intensive care unit. It's going to be in the incubator, and then they usually deliver it with a C-section, right? Because the baby is premature, and that's the current treatment, because they say there is no cure. Well, guess what? Something as simple and dirt cheap as aspirin can be so dramatically beneficial. It's amazing. And if you show this to your doctor, chances are, because it's only one study so far, or at least this one I think was on humans, the doctor will first of all will probably have never heard of it. Second of all, will probably try to brush it aside or even laugh at it, because many of these doctors went through medical school in their entire careers thinking and being told by the FDA and other medical authorities that preeclampsia/eclampsia is incurable. We can't do anything about it. Well, guess what? We can.
Wow. I think some women might confuse aspirin with other non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs like Tylenol or Advil. Can you just touch on that
You
briefly?
absolutely do not. None of these drugs, the other ones you mentioned, ibuprofen, Tylenol, also known as paracetamol, or acetaminophen is another name. So ibuprofen. There's also another one called naproxen sodium. So all of these drugs together with aspirin are in a category called NSAID, non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs. And when you go to your doctor and you talk about aspirin, they don't like aspirin. They've been taught that aspirin is really, it can damage your stomach, can increase risk of bleeding, can do a lot of other bad things. So they will often silently, like if you ask for aspirin, they will silently give you either ibuprofen or naproxen sodium, and they'll tell you, like later on, if you ask them, they say, "Oh, it's the same thing. They work the same way." It's because of the official medical version is that all of these NSAID drugs work by inhibiting an enzyme called COX, cyclooxygenase, COX. While that's true, the benefit of aspirin in this case wasn't mostly due to inflammation and inhibiting the inflammation. So other NSAID drugs, and the study did test them, only aspirin had the beneficial effect. So it must be something else. It is only aspirin that had this benefit. So if you have preeclampsia or eclampsia or are considered at a high risk of developing it and are considering replicating the study, I would only consider and or take aspirin. None of the other drugs have the same mechanism of action.
And that's true. Would you say for anyone who's looking to take an NSAID for inflammatory purposes, not just a pregnant woman?
Absolutely. Every single one of the NSAID drugs, with the notable exception of aspirin, has a known lethal side effect, sudden cardiac death. And ibuprofen, I think, is the one that has the highest risk, to the point where FDA now is requiring black box warnings on these drugs that are sold over the counter. And your doctor will tell you, yes, don't worry about it. It's only with long-term usage. The risk is low. Well, the risk is low until it happens to you.
Mm.
And why even use that drug until considering that you have a drug that's known to not only not have an increased risk of cardiovascular disease, but actually is known to prevent it. So isn't this a no-brainer? You have this drug right there. It's cheaper even than the ibuprofen. It has longer history of usage. It has better known side effect profile. It's all of these things that it has going on for it. Yet the doctor is like, no, it's just an NSAID. Take the other pill. So that's a
Yeah.
great example of your doctor doesn't know better. And this is also a great example of if you challenge your doctor, you may get yelled out of the room. But I would firmly stand my ground on aspirin. And my doctor, my own doctor, already knows, doesn't even dare to bring up aspirin in any discussion.
Awesome. Okay, this one here, niacinamide may fully prevent miscarriages and/or birth defects.
Yes, and this is a great one because they actually explain fully the mechanism of action of niacinamide. Niacinamide is a type of vitamin B3. You can buy it from pretty much any grocery store or vitamin store, Target, Walmart, you name it, Amazon, you name it. And this is a great study because it explained that most miscarriages and or birth defects are not due to some kind of a trauma or genetic issue, which is what mainstream medicine tries to tell you it is, but actually due to an energetic deficiency in the mother's organism. So in other words, the health of the fetus is fully, and whether the fetus will be carried to term, is fully determined by how well the mother produces energy from food. And vitamin B3 happens to be a crucial cofactor. Vitamin niacinamide converts into the body after you ingest it, converts into something called NAD. And you can see NAD in some of the underlying quotes there from the study, where they say that NAD, which is a crucial cofactor for synthesizing energy, is low in women with that basically are suffering frequent miscarriages and or delivering babies with birth defects. And fully preventing the miscarriages and the birth defects was possible with something as simple as giving the mother a relatively low dosage of this vitamin B3. You can achieve the same thing in a human being with a single capsule of 500 milligrams daily. And most products on the market that sell niacinamide do come in 500 milligram capsules daily. The cost will be fraction of a cent a day. And yet again, if you go to your doctor and say, how can I prevent miscarriages? How can I prevent birth defects? The doctor will just throw his or her arms up in the air and say, there's nothing we can do about it. It's all in God's hands. It's in your genes. Maybe you have bad genes. We don't know why it's happening. We can't prevent it. You just sit there and take it. Well, guess what? You can. And it costs almost nothing, next to nothing.
Wow. All right, this one you posted on you started posting stuff on a personal blog of yours.
Yes.
Allopregnanolone deficiency during pregnancy causes autism.
That's right. So allopregnanolone is a steroid. It's a neurosteroid, and the neurosteroid means a steroid that has actions predominantly on the brain. There are several of them, and the better known ones are pregnenolone, progesterone, DHEA, and allopregnanolone. And allopregnanolone just happens to be synthesized from progesterone, and progesterone is synthesized from pregnenolone. So it because progesterone is so important for pregnancy, right? If you have a deficiency of progesterone, pregnancy cannot be carried to term, right? So allopregnanolone, deficiency of allopregnanolone immediately suggests a deficiency of progesterone and consequently a deficiency of pregnenolone. And the synthesis of steroids, just like everything else in the organism, also depends on energy. So an allopregnanolone deficiency is an indirect way of saying there is an energetic production deficiency in the organism of the mother. But specific, it can manifest in many different ways, right? It's not, you can if you don't produce enough energy, that can hit any of the systems that depend on energy production for proper functioning. In this case, it happens to be the synthesis of allopregnanolone, of the all of the neurosteroids, right? So allopregnanolone it has this beneficial effect, has an anabolic effect on the brain. FDA recently approved allopregnanolone as an actual treatment for postpartum depression for the mothers. So, and since depression is thought to mostly originate in the brain, you can immediately see that apparently allopregnanolone has these greatly beneficial effects on the brain. And since autism is also considered a brain condition, you can immediately see how the deficiency of allopregnanolone, since it's so important for the mother, well, the presumption is probably it will be important for the fetus as well, because the fetus is also exposed to the steroids that the mother's brain is exposed to. And a deficiency in allopregnanolone in the mother causes depression. I guess in the fetus, in this case, it was shown to cause autism. But the reason I like this study is that, one way to take this study is that, okay, so if I take allopregnanolone, I may be able to prevent autism developing in my child. Yes, but a better approach would be to take this as a sign that there is an energetic deficiency in the organism and trying to work towards correcting that, because you don't know what other systems may have been affected by the energetic deficiency. So this is the approach that modern medicine tries to take, and we're trying to avoid that. In other words, they see an imbalance in one system and they try to go and correct it immediately. Well, nothing works in isolation. Everything is systemic. So you don't know whether by correcting this specific deficiency, you will not be throwing something else off balance, right? So the correct way is you need to find the root cause. And in metabolic theory, the root cause is always invariably some kind of interference with the efficient production of energy from food. So trying to correct that deficiency would be the way to go, or at the very least, work several as close to the root cause as possible. And I already mentioned that allopregnanolone is derived from progesterone. So a safer approach would be to try to take to progesterone, because progesterone is already approved for usage in pregnant women. It is the cardinal endogenous protective factor for both mother and fetus. Every doctor, even mainstream doctor, acknowledges that. And it has multiple other beneficial effects, including improving the production of energy from food. And if you don't want to use progesterone, progesterone is derived from pregnenolone. That will be an even higher level to go at. You can take pregnenolone. And guess what? Pregnenolone is synthesized from cholesterol under the influence of thyroid hormone. So the very top level would be things like taking thyroid hormone, which is similar to red light, which you see shining behind me, which you also have, right? Those are very top level mechanisms which ensure the proper production of energy. So again, the way I'll take this study would be autism is a condition in the child which results from an energetic deficiency, a metabolic deficiency in the mother, and it's manifested in this case specifically by deficiency in allopregnanolone. You can try the allopregnanolone. I think you're shooting a little bit in the dark. It's still better than what your doctor will tell you, because your doctor will tell you we just have no idea what's causing autism, but we know the rates are increasing. And the proper way would be to go as high up the chain as possible and as closest as you can to red light, thyroid, glucose oxidation, inhibiting fatty acid oxidation, taking aspirin, taking niacinamide, things like that.
Or taking like daily
Daily
progestin,
progesterone, pregnenolone,
yeah.
even cholesterol will be fine, but cholesterol needs to convert, and so taking the preformed steroid like pregnenolone, progesterone will be better.
Awesome. Okay, thanks. This is awesome, Georgi.
Oh yes.
All right,
So
big one, right? A lot of people think that fertility, when you get to a certain age, right, fertility kind of drops, and so this one, fertility depends on metabolism.
yes, absolutely. So this is a great study because, like, if you go to your doctor and if you're already menopausal, basically they'll tell you it's over. There's just no way natural biological pregnancy can happen. Even if we take eggs from the woman and then they try to like fertilize them artificially, that's just not going to happen because the eggs are not viable. Well, guess what? And it's considered an irreversible process. That's the other thing. So once you hit menopause, there is no coming back. Well, guess what? Again, metabolic theory for the last 100 years has been coming up with counterexamples, and it usually involved giving menopausal women large doses of progesterone, and in many cases, these women start getting their periods back. In fact, there are several people who did experiments on their own wives, and their wives got pregnant in their 60s. Now, I'm not saying that I'm advocating that. I'm just bringing it up as an example of how apparently many things that we're being told are irreversible, they're in your genes, etc., etc. That's certainly not the case. We have strong evidence to the contrary. And this is a great study because we just talked about red light, and they showed that exposing basically infertile women, women that are already in the so-called advanced reproductive age, exposing the neck of these women to concentrated red light in the form of a red laser, resulted in more than 21% of them becoming pregnant after being officially told it's over. There's no way under the sun that you can get naturally pregnant. And 21% of them did. More importantly, the actual study looked at the mechanism and why the red light worked, and it found out that that exposure to red light dramatically increased the production of ATP, which is the final byproduct of the metabolic process of generating energy from food. ATP is a great surrogate of how well you're converting your food to energy. ATP is the energetic carrier, the energetic molecule, akin to gasoline in the car. That's what your body uses to do everything. Pretty much every process in the body depends on ATP. And they found out that exposure to red light was a powerful stimulator of the whole metabolic cascade. Furthermore, they went even further and said the same process should apply to infertile males, because when they looked at sperm from males that are infertile, males don't necessarily go through like a very visible process of menopause, right? A true menopause, menopause, but they do become infertile after a certain age, and it's been thought that it's simply infertility of old age. Guess what? It was also due to a low ATP level, low ATP production, and when they exposed sperm from infertile men to red light, the sperm became fully capable of fertilizing an egg. Even sperm from males with very advanced age, like in their 90s, that were have long given up hope on having kids, or even wanting to have kids.
Yeah.
But this study showed that they're perfectly capable. It all comes down to energy production from food.
Wow. Wow. And with you talking about the red light, if I got this red light from Red Light Man, and it's just a bulb that I could turn on, I got to shake it around a little bit because I've had it for a couple years now. But I mean, would that be as simple as someone just kind of sitting here and kind of meditating and shining it on the thyroid gland for a few minutes? I mean,
yeah, thyroid gland, or or the neck, basically any area where we have major blood vessels being close to the surface, because red light penetrates very well. So red light, even though it looks like it's mostly reflected from your skin, it actually can penetrate to about 2.5 inches underneath. And 2.5 inches, it's not a small amount. 2.5 inches is probably deep enough to touch most of the major arteries, and it just so happens that you have several of them in the neck, and the neck is not that big of an area. So whether you do it like here on your thyroid gland or behind on your back, any of these areas should work. And most of the studies that use lasers, they use relatively brief exposure, about 30 minutes, and the laser is a much more smaller dot. It's not like the lights that you and I use. So ours will be less intense, but they will probably have more systemic effect because they're hitting a much bigger surface area, and it's the surface area that counts. So the bigger surface area that you can hit, the more systemic the effect of the red light exposure is. And typically the studies show that 15 to 30 minutes is plenty, and 60 minutes right now they're actually using to actually treat cancer, which will be maybe a topic for another discussion.
Sure. Wow. Jeez. Okay. And Georgie, with any of these, if you want to just say pass and move on to the next one, that's totally cool too. Your choice, obviously. This one, thyroid hormone in babies controls pancreas development and diabetes risk.
Yeah, so this is a great one because officially the official story is that diabetes type 1 is a genetically driven condition. So if it runs in the family, chances are, I mean, you're at a much higher risk, and you're probably carrying a gene of some sort that basically increases your risk for developing diabetes type 1. Well, as it turns out, it's simply due to that increased risk is not due to a gene, but apparently it's due to a low thyroid hormone in the mother while the baby was still in the womb. Remember the 1,000-day rule? So anything that stresses the mom will automatically lower thyroid hormone production, and will consequently increase the stress hormones such as cortisol, adrenaline, ACTH, CRH. All of these are stress hormones. So again, one more reason to keep stress down. It's not just about the mom. It has vital effect on imprinting the baby, possibly for life. Now things can change, but it definitely has a very, very important effect. And in this case, it was shown that chronically low circulating levels of thyroid hormone in the mom essentially imprinted the fetus to produce less insulin in their pancreas and be much more susceptible to reaching a condition where eventually the pancreatic beta cells fail completely, and that's diabetes type 1, insulin dependent diabetes type 1.
Wow, awesome. This is a kind of a collection of things about imprinting. We don't have to talk about all of them, but I thought a couple of these were interesting. One here I wanted to highlight: SSRI use during pregnancy doubles child autism risk. You already kind of touched on some of the kind of prescribed medications being harmful, but do you want to touch on SSRI during pregnancy and autism at all?
Yeah, SSRIs are huge, especially for women who are thinking of becoming pregnant or even are pregnant, because doctors have taken on the view that now they're allowed to sort of treat postpartum depression preventatively. Because there's such a great risk of developing postpartum depression, they have no qualms prescribing antidepressant drugs, and the vast majority of these of the SSRI kind, which are heavily serotonergic. They're prescribing. So first of all, quite a few women are on antidepressants even before they get pregnant. So these drugs actually dramatically lower fertility. It will be very difficult for a woman to become pregnant while on an SSRI. And then after that, even if pregnancy happens, these drugs dramatically increase the risk of miscarriage, of birth defects, of eclampsia / preeclampsia. Kim Kardashian is a famous celebrity who had like both of her natural pregnancies, she had preeclampsia and the children had to be taken out early. She has been on SSRIs her whole life, and very, very, very large doses too. So, and then even if nothing happens to the mom, this SSRI usage during pregnancy, the doctor will probably try to convince the mom to get on an SSRI to prevent postpartum depression happening after the baby is being born. It's really a very nefarious system. And now serotonin, which the SSRI drugs are known to increase, serotonin at this point has been conclusively linked to the increase, not to increase, but as a direct cause of autism. And you don't hear that much about it in the news simply because it's such a touchy topic. If the public suddenly becomes aware on a mass scale of what's going on, the sales for SSRI drugs will plummet, and those drugs for some drug companies generate the majority of their revenue. And they're so widely used. They're approved for usage in children as young as 1 year of age. I don't even know how a psychiatrist would diagnose 1-year-old baby as with depression. Like what diagnostic criteria would be used? There is no objective test for depression. Everything is based on talk. Your psychiatrist talks to you, and the way you react, the way you respond. They have a special checklist. It's called DSM, Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Psychiatric Diseases. At this point, is already in version 4 release, edition 4. But it requires an adult. It requires a talking, interacting human being. How the hell they diagnose a baby with depression is really beyond me. But these drugs are approved for usage in babies as well, and they're known without a doubt to be able to cause autism. And autism rates are skyrocketing.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Oh, they are. And so would it work kind of in the opposite direction too? Like if someone was doing, behaviors or eating food or taking supplements that go in the anti-serotonergic direction, is that
Exactly.
going to
There are several studies on the forum which I can send you with anti-serotonin drugs, especially the drug cyproheptadine, and they're being used on children with already established autism, trying to reverse it. So I think instead of rather than waiting for the child to develop autism, first of all, there are antidepressant drugs that are non-serotonergic. Many women don't know that, but they are there. They exist. They are approved by the FDA, and women can simply ask to be switched to that drug instead of taking the SSRI. Doctor legally is not supposed to deny such a request unless there is serious evidence that a specific drug is simply counterindicated for the specific case of the patient taking it. But in most cases, there is no such reason. So first thing you can do is switch over to another drug that's not serotonergic. And second of all, you can take, if you've been exposed to serotonergic drugs for a long period of time, such as Kim Kardashian, You can take anti-serotonin drugs or eat anti-serotonergic foods or take anti-serotonergic supplements and greatly diminish the risk of the child developing autism. And if autism is already there, in many cases, it should be reversible. The studies that I saw with children with already established autism said that there is nothing irreversible about autism. It seems to be simply an overactive serotonergic system.
Wow. Wow, and isn't like reduced serotonin or anti-serotonergic kind of properties in an organism associated with like pro-social behavior and fun and I guess my question is what are some of those like supplements that a pregnant woman or anyone could take that could easily kind of reduce the possibility of serotonin issues, I guess.
So some of the easiest things that are over the counter include aspirin. Aspirin is great for reducing serotonin. Basically, even a baby aspirin tablet drops blood serotonin levels by about 30%.
Wow.
Um, Progesterone is a great one. First, for two reasons, I guess. One, it's approved for usage of pregnant women. Most doctors will not be against the woman taking some extra progesterone. Most women are actually nowadays deficient in it, just as men are deficient in testosterone. And because it's approved for use in pregnant women, the doctor should be okay with it. But progesterone also happens to inhibit the enzyme that synthesizes serotonin from the amino acid tryptophan. That enzyme is called tryptophan hydroxylase, and basically progesterone happens to be an inhibitor of that enzyme. So you'll be killing two birds with one stone. Actually, multiple birds with one stone, because progesterone usage has been shown to result in a dramatically increased IQ score in children when the mom has been taking extra progesterone. It has also been shown to virtually prevent birth defects, even in mothers that are being exposed to ionizing radiation, such as Chernobyl. It has been shown to reduce the risk of both postpartum depression for the mom and life-threatening infections for the child after the child is being born. It has been shown to imprint the child with dramatically increased resistance to infectious disease later in life, both viral and bacterial. It has been shown to dramatically decrease the risk of the child for future autoimmune conditions. Same thing happens with the mom as well. Just there's nothing you can do wrong if you're a pregnant woman and ask the doctor for extra progesterone.
Wow.
Vitamin E is another great one. Pregnenolone is a great anti-serotonin agent as well. And in general, eating foods that have good quality protein and adding a little bit of gelatin to it, because gelatin is deficient in the amino acid tryptophan, and since serotonin can only be synthesized from tryptophan, eating less tryptophan automatically means generating less serotonin. But and since it's hard to choose all the foods all the time that have low tryptophan, an easier thing would be take an aspirin with the meal, because aspirin inhibits the absorption of tryptophan from the food, and or take a spoon of gelatin, because gelatin also inhibits the absorption of tryptophan and also opposes the conversion of tryptophan into serotonin after it's been already assimilated.
Wow, that's really useful information. Thank you. All right, let me go back here to the imprinting. There's another one here I thought was interesting. Obese men may pass obesity on to their children. You want to? I mean,
Yes.
I just thought that was kind of interesting. You want to touch on that?
Yeah, so this is one of the studies that really kind of threw a wrench in the wheel of the mainstream genetics theory and inheritance, because even to this day, if you go to your doctor, they'll tell you that the health of the child mostly depends on the health of the mother genetically and the father. But since there's no obesity gene discovered, obesity is treated so far, and correctly so, as strictly an environmental phenomenon. But remember, neo-Darwinists, the statists is what I call them, they don't believe that you can pass like an acquired characteristic to your child, such as if you were lean as a child and if you were lean as a young adult, and then you became obese in middle age, and then you had a child, your offspring should not have increased susceptibility to obesity, because there's no gene that's associated with obesity, and you're only supposed to pass on your genes to your offspring, not anything else. Well, guess what? The study found that through the process of epigenetics, since obesity clearly and probably intuitively so is associated with lower metabolism, right? The sperm can also get imprinted with specific methylation patterns on the genes that tell the fetus that the father was obese. And if that's the case, that so people will probably say, well, what is this information? Why is information of the father's obesity being passed on to the child? Well, because it's an information about the environment. And that's what the organism really does. It's in constant communication with its environment, even across generations. So if the father is obese, that is a sign, unlike what many people think, is it's not a sign of plentiness, of plentiful and abundant environment. It's actually a sign of stress. It's been shown that people who live in squalid, malnourished conditions, unless you're really starving, right? In that case, you will be malnourished. But actually, these people, malnourished people, when they actually nursed back to health and given food, they actually become overweight. It's an overcompensating mechanism to stress because it's a message from the environment that in your life, your specific life, the obese individual, food is hard to come by, conditions are harsh, and you should store any food that you find. You should store it as fuel, as fat, to be used at a later time, and not immediately burn it off through a very fast metabolism and convert it to a CO2, ATP, and water. And that's what this study really found. Then the father is probably just as involved in the health of the child, at least until conception, right? Than the mother is. And further studies later on showed that the mitochondria, which up until 2 months ago was thought to be passed on strictly and entirely only on the mother's side, they also found out that the father's DNA also passes on mitochondrial DNA to the child as well.
Wow.
So really, many of the stories we've been told in school are at best incorrect, and at worst, they're really corrupt lies with the goal of nothing more but generating profit.
Awesome.
So the message here is the father's health matters. It's not just about this one brief event of conception. Then it's that's it. After that, you're just a provider. No, your health directly determines the health of your children as well.
So when we're talking about this prenatal and neonatal, and this is the whole family. I mean, we're talking about everybody.
Absolutely, it's one organism, really. If you think about it, three or more separate bodies, but really one consciousness.
Love it. I mean, you've touched on this a little bit, but this one, stress effects are inherited up to 3 generations later. Wow.
Yeah, and they even say the mechanism is RNA. In other words, the gene expression. So yes, the genes do not mutate. They don't change from like a single generation to the next most of the time, right? They could be a random mutation, as they call it. But it's what you pass on to your children, and what determines their life is the expression of these genes, which is controlled by your lifestyle and your environment. So if you have lived stressful life, up to 3 generations later, your offspring will sense it in a very literal sense.
Wow. Okay, we won't. I'll skip this one, but autism and kind of another thing, disease linked to mother's thyroid function. So our available energy playing such a big role.
Yep.
How about this one? Chronic stress during pregnancy accelerates fetal aging and harms its health.
Yes. So basically, what happens here is that when the mother is exposed to chronic stress, just as I said, this immediately turns off the production of thyroid hormone and starts shifting the metabolism away from the oxidation of glucose to the oxidation of fat. And that is a systemic stress signal. And since the baby is very literally part of the mother while it's in the womb, the baby is also exposed to these signals. In other words, the baby is also being told, guess what? The environment is really not good right now. And, things need to change in your little organism as well in order to accommodate these stressors. And it's the stress hormone, CRH, which starts the whole stress cascade. CRH stands for corticotropin releasing hormone, and it's released in the hypothalamus. It's a portion of your brain. And that hormone, when it's released, it goes to your pituitary. It tells you to release another hormone called ACTH. Then that hormone starts circulating in your blood, ends up going to the adrenals. As soon as the adrenals sense it, then they start pumping out cortisol. And it's basically this. What the study showed is that the elevation of CRH is what imprinted the fetus started these epigenetic patterns, because the fetus is exposed to the elevated CRH in the mother's organism. It basically started these patterns of accelerated aging. So in other words, stress is a signal for the organism that the environment is really not beneficial, and the organism should focus on reproduction. So CRH in this case, so they measured a number of different gene expressions, and they found out that a number of different gene expressions associated with early puberty, decreased fertility, basically earlier menopause. All of these are things that are associated with stress, because the body basically tells you should hurry up, reproduce, because resources are limited, and then whatever time you have remaining, you focus, you're dedicated to raising your children, but you basically you're not very viable. You're not going to live a long, productive life. And they found that stress through the direct biomarker, the direct mediator CRH, so environmental stress through CRH causes directly these changes in the fetus. And just as we said in the previous study, these changes are probably they propagated multiple generations later, at least three.
Wow. You mentioned early puberty, and I know Ray Pete has written about that a lot or talked about it, about the value or the benefits of delaying puberty. Can
Yes.
can you can you speak to that? Because I think that might surprise some people that actually like the time of puberty might have an effect on the health of the organism for later life and on and on.
Yeah, I mean, puberty is just like puberty for both sexes is just like menopause for women. So puberty, it's the beginning of the life cycle after which the organism can reproduce. And reproduction is actually considered a non-beneficial development in an organism's lifetime, because reproduction is when you simply produce more copies of yourself because you don't think you have much longer to live. It basically, if the goal of the organism is survival and reproduction, um, and reproduction is ultimately linked to survival. And by survival, we mean the survival of these specific genes that you're carrying. So looked at from this angle, or inside this context, you'll see that reproduction is not something that's really a sign of your specific life going well. In other words, the earlier you start getting, you earlier you're capable of reproducing. This means the harsher the environment likely is, and that's why the environment is pushing you towards starting the reproduction later, so you have a higher chance of your genes being carried over to the next generation. So the early puberty is a phenomenon that's been studied for at least 200 years. It is well known to be associated almost perfectly with early menopause. So in other words, the earlier you start reproducing, the earlier you're going to stop reproducing. And because all of these things take energy. So in other words, if your aging process starts earlier, if we assume that that's what reproduction is, like the puberty, then it's also probably going to be ending earlier, because it simply means since everything takes energy, you're not producing enough energy. And that's a very expensive process, which after you've done enough of it, the body says, I cannot maintain it any longer. I need the energy for more important things, such as keeping you alive. So the earlier you start reproducing, the earlier you're going to stop reproducing for both men and women. It has been shown to be associated with virtually every chronic disease out there, from cancer to diabetes, to osteoporosis, to neurological slash neurodegenerative diseases, to basically reduce fertility, to all-cause mortality. In other words, there are these statistical studies where they simply look at what's the chance of a single organism dying, and then what event in their life or what aspect of their life it is most strongly associated with. Well, early puberty is an outlier, essentially. It stands on its own with a very high correlation of about, I think, 0.92. It's not very often you see something with such a high correlation when it comes to epidemiological studies. And early puberty and all-cause mortality are extremely highly correlated. So in general, puberty slash reproduction means your life, or at least the peak of your life, is already passed, right? And you're preparing to pass on the torch to the next generation. So clearly, the earlier this happens, the earlier you expect to leave the planet. Otherwise, you
Wow.
continue to doing your own thing.
Yeah. So if you and your family are doing things to support a biologically energetic environment, don't be surprised if puberty happens at a later age. Is that kind of what we're saying too?
Yeah, yeah, and it's been noticed the royal families, at least the ones that have been studied in Europe, they've been known, their children, aside from the fact that there was a very high rate of inbreeding, they were known to actually start their puberty extremely late due to the very low stress, opulent lifestyle that they were enjoying. Some of them, some of the records, basically show that some of the nobility had their puberty start as late as their early 20s, which is unheard of these days. In most developed societies, puberty right now starts around the age of 9, and anything more than your early teens, like let's say 12 or 13, is probably going to be considered delayed puberty. You will get sent to the doctor. You'll undergo a battery of tests and trying to find out what's wrong with you. Maybe it's a pituitary disorder. Maybe it's a tumor of some sort, etc., etc. Well, in the 17 and 1800s, there were cases when people had their puberty in their early 20s, and
Wow.
those people ended up living to an extremely old age, over 100. So
So,
longevity and late puberty are also associated, just like early death and early puberty are.
so if one of our kids comes home and they're being self-conscious about the fact that other people are going through puberty and they aren't yet, maybe we can kind of say, hey, no, that's a good thing. That's okay.
That's a great thing, not just
Yeah.
a good one. So I
Yeah.
wouldn't rush towards it. Reproducing is again, it's basically the nature's way of saying your genes need to find more hosts because this one isn't doing well enough.
Awesome. All right, I'll flip through some of these here. This is good because you touched on endotoxin earlier. I think technically lipopolysaccharide or if you go to PubMed, that's what we want to search, not endotoxin.
Yeah.
But anyway, you touched on endotoxin earlier. Can you talk about this one? Endotoxin may be a major cause of preterm births.
Yes. So most of the doctors haven't even heard of endotoxin. Well, actually, they have, but in medical school, it's really not very commonly recognized biomarker chemically, and most doctors do not associate it with anything. So first of all, many of them would probably not even know what you mean by endotoxin. If you say lipopolysaccharide, it may bring up some memories from medical school, back from medical school, but even then, they will mostly associate it with inflammation, which is correct. But it also happens that chronic inflammation, chronic exposure to endotoxin immediately interferes with the proper production of energy. It's a powerful systemic metabolic inhibitor, and anything that inhibits metabolism, as we saw in the previous studies, is associated with the preterm births, birth defects, more increased morbidity and mortality for both mother and child. So it's not a surprise at all that a systemic metabolic inhibitor would have this effect. Unfortunately, most of the efforts of doctors are focused on finding out genetic causes for preterm birth and not environmental ones. And endotoxin happens to be not only a purely environmental one, but also a very obscure one. There aren't many tests that the doctor can do for endotoxin. There is one, but it's mostly being used for people with HIV because it turned out, unsurprisingly, that endotoxin and its levels in the blood are directly correlated with mortality in HIV patients. But as far as endotoxin's role in pregnancy, chances are there's not a single medical professional on this planet that is even studying this, let alone practicing endotoxin restriction slash removal or reduction in order to improve the health of the pregnancy.
What are some practical ways someone can lower endotoxic load or endotoxic response?
As I mentioned earlier, eating foods that are easily digestible. All food should digest preferably in the stomach and the upper portion of the small intestine. Anything that reaches undigested your colon, the microbiome that is so talked about these days, will actually use it as food, and as a result of the bacterial die-off, so any kind of a food that gets to the colon increases bacterial turnover. And endotoxin is part of the bacterial wall. So any kind of a bacterial die-off, which will happen during bacterial turnover, will release this endotoxin in the colon. And then, depending on how permeable the barrier of the colon is, this endotoxin may, actually, it will, in many cases, get in your bloodstream. And as soon as it gets into your bloodstream, the whole inflammatory slash anti-metabolic cascade starts. So, eating foods that are very easily digestible and don't reach undigested, they don't reach the colon in an undigested state is of paramount importance. And then things that decrease the absorption of endotoxin, such as charcoal or insoluble fiber, such as the carrot salad, the bamboo shoots, turnips, ground turnips would be also great. So anything with insoluble fiber in it, in general, helps to bind endotoxin and excrete it with the fecal mass and prevents it from getting into the bloodstream.
Got it. You're talking raw carrot salad,
Yes,
right?
raw carrot, raw grated carrot, raw grated turnips, or in general, root vegetables that you can grate on a salad and do a little bit of vinegar and olive oil and salt and that should be enough to get into the colon and reduce endotoxin.
Awesome. Almost kind of like a natural antibiotic of some
Yeah,
sort.
they do have antibiotic properties for that reason because the root vegetables, they've naturally developed defenses against pathogens that live in the soil, and most of the pathogens in the soil are bacteria and fungi. So it's a great natural antifungal, antibacterial mechanism.
Awesome. Okay. Another thing on progesterone, I'll skip it, but it just seems like progesterone is.
Yeah, I don't
Right.
think this should be news at this point to
Yeah.
anyone. Even your doctor, like the woman's doctor, the pregnant woman's doctor, will not raise his or her eyebrows when you say that progesterone has X benefit for pregnancy.
And I feel like most people haven't even heard of progesterone. I mean, I don't volunteer. I don't go out of my way to talk about it to most people, but I haven't heard really anyone talking about it other than kind of like us and people who are kind of into Ray Pete's work. I just don't hear that used very much.
Yeah, it's kind of fallen out of favor because nowadays all the rage is the synthetic progestins because around the 50s, big pharma wanted to get in that market of selling steroids, and in order for you to make a lot of profit from a steroid, it has to be patentable. Well, natural things are not patentable, so they couldn't make a lot of money out of natural progesterone. So they convinced the public that developing these synthetic derivatives of progesterone, that these derivatives are much better because they're much more potent than progesterone, and they allow a much smaller dosage to basically achieve the same effects. That's not true. As it turned out, that these synthetic progestins are actually, they have estrogenic effects instead of anti-estrogenic like natural progesterone does. It turned out these synthetic progestins actually have androgenic effects. In fact, many of them are derivatives of the androgen 19-nortestosterone. Right there, it tells you in the molecule name that it's a testosterone derivative. It's not a progesterone derivative. But anyway, so most of the practice, gynecological practice these days, revolves around the synthetic progesterones for two reasons. Number one, doctors don't even get schooled much on natural progesterone because they're learning in medical school that synthetic progesterones are just as good and usually better than natural progesterone. And they're much more easily absorbable when taken by mouth, while progesterone is being promoted as a hormone that only works if you give it as an injection, which is not true, right? And then second of all, um, most doctors these days, they get a cut from the sales of any drug they push on a patient slash client. Speaking of client, according to the FDA, your doctor is no longer your doctor. It is simply a provider slash vendor of services, in parentheses, medical services. And you're no longer a patient, you're a consumer of services slash health services. So that's all there is. It is a transactional mechanism. You're going to your doctor to buy his or her expertise, quote unquote, and get a fix from a specific chemical. As Chris Rock, the comedian, once used to say in one of his shows, he was saying, he was talking about these commercials of drugs on the TV, and they usually start with, ask your doctor about Xarelto, or ask your
Right.
doctor about Viagra. And he was saying, ask my doctor about a drug? If I'm asking my doctor, instead of he or she telling me, then he's not a doctor, he's a drug dealer. So keep in mind that most doctors, even if not all of them, even the most well-meaning ones, they have student loans to pay, and money in their world matters as it does everywhere else. And they get a huge cut. Well, I shouldn't say a huge. They get a much bigger portion. They have a much bigger profit from selling a synthetic drug, such as the synthetic progestins, than they will do from selling a natural bioidentical progesterone. And it's not even available, very, very easily available. Even if you wanted natural progesterone, your doctor will probably ask you to wait several weeks because it's not available. He or she has to do a special order. It will cost more. In the meantime, it's more opportunity for the doctor to try to brainwash you and take the synthetic progestin, etc., 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 and on it goes. When in reality, bioidentical progesterone and the synthetic progestins are incomparable. They have a very small overlap, and that overlap is shrinking by the minute in terms of how beneficial they are. Progesterone, largely beneficial. Synthetic progestins, largely carcinogenic.
Wow. And progesterone, you can just buy a bottle if you can find it dissolved in vitamin E for what, $20 or
Yep,
30
20,
bucks?
$30, and it's going to last for months.
Yeah. I thought this was really interesting. Breaking news: Viagra given to pregnant women is lethal for the babies.
Yes. So typically, women don't think of Viagra as a drug that's given to women, but because Viagra is a known vasodilator, and that's how it increases blood flow down there, right? It's used sometimes in neonatal intensive care units for babies that have problem with breathing. They have pulmonary problems. They have problems with their lungs. And Viagra is known to increase the synthesis of a chemical called nitric oxide. Nitric oxide is a very dangerous, metabolically speaking, chemical because it is one of the most potent suppressors of the energy producing enzyme cytochrome C oxidase. So even though it's a potent vasodilator and it may help in an emergency, it shouldn't be something that's taken on a regular basis. Well, they found out that when Viagra is given to pregnant organisms, I think they used a rodent model in this case. I don't think it was a human one. But basically, what they did is they gave it to the pregnant organisms with the hope that the babies, when they're born, they will have less of a chance of developing a pulmonary problem. Well, guess what? It turned out to be lethal to about 20% of the fetuses. So nitric oxide, by being this potent metabolic inhibitor, directly killed a significant portion of the babies before they were even born. So think twice about raising nitric oxide or taking any of these drugs that are being handed out like candy.
Wow, which is weird because I hear in so many circles people talking about raising nitric oxide as a good thing.
Yep.
Uh, you want to touch on this here? Remarkable decline in fertility, half the world below replacement levels.
Yeah, and once again, it ties great with the metabolic theory because again, the metabolic theory of health says whenever you're under stress, your metabolic efficiency, your metabolic effectiveness declines. You don't produce energy as efficiently as before, and as a consequence of this, your body will simply shut down any non-vital function in order to preserve the vital ones, considering that the energetic resources are limited. Well, reproduction is such a function. It's not necessary for your immediate survival. It may be necessary for the procreation and survival of your genes, but if you're being faced by a famine or war or other kind of a stressor, then fertility is expected to decline simply because it's not conducive to immediate survival. And multiple studies across the entire world have been finding that since the 1970s, there's been a remarkable decline in fertility to the point in both men and women, to the point where at this point in the Western countries, it is below replacement levels. So let's say typically they say that for every person on the planet, you need to have a fertility rate of 1 point, let's say 1.4 people, in order to have a non-declining population. At this point, the fertility rate per person is below 1. In other words, the worst population, at least in developed countries, is dying off and it's not getting replaced. And the explanation, my explanation, and many that is supported by studies, is that simply the health of people has declined, and one of the greatest surrogates of good health is your ability to beget and to give birth and to carry to term of babies. Because babies are such an energetic burden on the mother's organism, the fact that the mother was able to carry a baby to full term is a testament to a robust energetic production. And if conversely, if that is not happening, if there is a problem with conception, could be the father's fault. So this declining fertility, it seems to be the blame seems to be on both sides, not just the women but men as well. And ultimately, the blame lies in the suboptimal environment we live in. We're surrounded by toxins 24/7.
Do you think you said to carry a baby full term? Do you think women who are like the due date is such a guess anyway, but who go to due date or a week later or 2 weeks later, do you think they should be worried about anything? I mean,
No, I think it's actually a sign that that basically the body is saying that the baby can use a little bit of extra development, a little bit of extra exposure to progesterone. The baby's basically because the baby is such an energetic burden. Don't worry, the organism of the mother will kick the baby out as soon as it decides that the baby is well developed. And if it isn't, then usually a great way to accelerate the development and actually speed up natural labor to occur instead of getting induced, which has a number of side effects that most doctors will simply choose not to talk about, such as increases the risk of emergency C-section, increases the risk of maternal death, increases the risk of fetal death. increases the risk of brain damage for the fetus, of a number of different chronic diseases and abnormalities later in life, etc., etc. One of the best ways to accelerate actually regular birth is if the term has arrived and the baby is not coming out, then basically giving the mother, increasing the caloric intake of the mom, and mostly in the form of carbohydrates, and taking some extra progesterone, usually for about a week, is usually enough to trigger labor, simply because it gives it that one last good push, one
Hmm.
last good kick to the baby, to the fetus to develop, and tell the mother's organism that I'm ready, I'm good to come out. You don't need to protect me anymore.
That's so funny. There's a pizza place in Sacramento, Northern California area, and I can't remember the name of it, but it's famous. It's developed a reputation for when women are at term or think that they're past term, and they go to this place and they eat this pizza. It's called like a pregnancy pizza. Like they're famous for women will go into labor that night, and
It's
it kind of goes
probably
to what you're
something
saying.
in the pizza. It's probably like either very high on protein and or carbs.
Yeah.
Um, this is the good explanation. The bad one is that it has some estrogenic chemical in it, and of course, anything estrogenic will oppose progesterone and will trigger labor.
Huh.
But the safe way to accelerate labor would be give the baby the resources it needs to develop fully, and after that, the organism of the mom will voluntarily kick it out.
Yeah, that sounds great. And if things are going well, the baby has no reason to leave, right? I mean, if the like you said,
Precisely. Yeah.
till it's time. I thought this one was interesting. I just kind of I don't know. I mean, it's so important, I think, to be present in our children's lives. Stress makes parents selfish and makes them neglect their children.
Yeah, and most of these studies are done. Actually, pretty much all of them are done with animal organisms, not non-human ones, because doing a research like that on humans would be considered unethical. But I think anecdotally, we have seen it in our lives as well. Typically, families that are struggling tremendously financially, one or both parents tend to develop some kind of a substance abuse problem, and eventually, basically, start just catering to their own addiction issue and neglect the rest of the family. I think this is a classic story that probably hits close to home for many people, maybe their neighbors, in some people in their own families. And this is, I like studies like this because they explain it. They first of all they give it a scientific back, and second of all they explain it energetically. And stress, if you again, the explanation is rather simple. If stress interferes with your ability to produce energy, then of course whatever limited resources you have, um, nature is designed organisms in such a way that you prioritize your own survival, at least to a certain degree,
Hmm.
over the survival of other people, including your own children. So if you're extremely energetically compromised, clearly you wouldn't care much about anything. And in some cases, in extreme cases, you even stop caring about yourself, right? The people with substance abuse, they're often very unkempt. They don't take showers. They don't eat well. And very often eventually they die simply because they stop caring about everything, including themselves. And
Yeah.
studies have been done, and they're actually solid evidence that people who are in extreme state of disrepair, of not caring about anything, they have very low levels of ATP. So that is right there your direct evidence. Even if it's not causal, right, you can use it as to prove a cause. You can say, well, it does sound plausible, and the epidemiological evidence shows that people who have low ATP levels, in other words, low metabolism, tend to not care about anything except themselves, and eventually not even about themselves either.
Wow. I thought this was great. One of the things I aim to do with this podcast is just kind of give ourselves a chance to return to our playful roots. And I don't know. I just think this is a cool one to highlight. Children are smarter than adults, and toddlers are smarter than children.
Yeah. Well, this is a lab that does a number of different experiments with children. They're all children, but they're just various ages. And I think the youngest ones that they work with are maybe at like 2 years old. Anything younger than that, it's hard because basically at that point the child is too attached to the mother to the point of they probably like not that they will refuse to work with another person, but they will start probably bonding with that person as they would with a parent, and most parents that would not sit well with parents. So I think 2 years is the youngest that they do, and it's been shown that basically the ability to learn new information, to incorporate new information and convert it into useful knowledge is the highest in the youngest children, in the children that are 2 to 3 years of age. And then it's less intense, but still very intense in children up to the age of about 12. And then after puberty starts, which reminds me of our discussion that puberty is actually the first sign of aging, the first sign of decline, then it dramatically drops off around puberty and never seems to recover. After that, it seems to be essentially either a steep or a gradual decline. There is a plateau around the age of 25, but after that, it's essentially all downhill. Now, it's not irreversible. It has been shown to be linked, again, to your energetic production. And there are multiple chemicals that have been shown to improve intelligence, to improve the ability to learn new things, almost to the level of the toddlers. And every single one of these chemicals has been known to have a potent pro-metabolic effect. So once again, we have even though the study is simply a correlation of age and intelligence, and it's an inverse correlation, it ultimately is tied down to metabolic theory and energy production, which we know is much more intense in children than it is in adults. So the whole paradigm of stupid children is wrong. I don't know who's pushing it, but there's probably some kind of a nefarious reason behind that. Children are smarter than adults, much smarter.
I say to people, and I'm not joking at all, that I'm learning more from just being around our 2.5-year-old and watching him than I ever have.
Yep.
It's just amazing.
Completely agree. I can confirm from my own 2 children.
It's awesome. All right, I'm gonna stop the share here. There's a few other questions I'd love to, if you're okay with continuing this marathon. A few other questions I'd like to.
How much more time? Because I have to be done by 4.
Okay, great. So where are we at? We're let me see. Did it go off the share screen for you?
Let me see. Yep, it did.
Okay. So let me. I want to talk. If let's see what time it is. Okay, so we got maybe a couple more minutes. I think it's a good time to kind of wrap it up. Can we talk about polyunsaturated fats? I think a lot of people either don't know what they are, or they think because they've read somewhere or heard from someone that unsaturated fats are actually healthy, and that saturated fats are unhealthy. Can you talk a little bit about that and how it might relate to a developing life?
That's a very extensive topic, but the quickest that I can summarize it with would be so basically the stability of the fats is what determines their health benefit or their negative effects. And the more unsaturated the fat is, the more unstable it is. Many people probably easily recognize this fact from rancid fish or rancid oil, the rancid cooking oils. And all of these are unsaturated fats. They usually come from either fish or from vegetables. And the fats that are stable, that are basically less saturated or completely saturated, and those happen to be olive oil, which is a monounsaturated fat, or coconut oil, which is a fully saturated fat, beef tallow, or any fat from a ruminant animal tends to be saturated as well. So in general, and by the way, the unsaturated fats are used by specific enzymes in our organism to produce inflammatory mediators directly. So right there you have a role, and knowing the important role of inflammation in preeclampsia, in eclampsia, in birth defects, in imprinting the child and the mother, subsequently their health for being good or bad. Any doctor, I mean, you walk into any primary care physician, they will tell you inflammation, chronic inflammation is not good, right? Well, guess what? The unsaturated fats, the omega-3s and the omega-6 are actually direct precursors to inflammation in the body. The less of them you eat, the less inflammation you'll have. There's just no other mechanism through which inflammation can be produced. And conversely, the more of them you eat, the more inflammation you'll have. But the damage of the unsaturated fat goes beyond inflammation. And we have to look at the steroids a little bit to get a comparison. So steroids such as progesterone, testosterone, dihydrotestosterone, pregnenolone, DHEA, these are the equivalent of either saturated fats or very, very little unsaturated fats, like monounsaturated fats, like olive oil. And hormones such as estrogen, aldosterone, cortisol, all of these steroids that are known to be detrimental to pregnancy and to health in general, they're highly unsaturated molecules, and they're very similar in structure to the omega-3 and the omega-6 fatty acids. So by intaking a large amount of the unsaturated fatty acids, not only you're increasing inflammation, you're also creating environment where the effects over the body are similar as if the levels of your unsaturated hormones was. In other words, fatty acids have hormonal effects, even though they don't necessarily very accurately bind to a specific steroid receptor. Their overall effects on the cell are similar to what the effects of these harmful steroids is. In other words, they will increase the cellular uptake of water. They will stimulate cell division. They will inhibit differentiation of a stem cell into an organ. In other words, they will push the organism, and also they inhibit the production of energy, of course, just like anything out there that's anti-metabolic. So in general, you're pushing the organism towards a low metabolic energy state and a state with increased basically signaling of cortisol, estrogen, aldosterone, prolactin, and every single one of these hormones is perfectly capable of terminating a pregnancy almost immediately. So clearly not something that you want a pregnant woman to be exposed to. And in general, anything that terminates pregnancy tends to be unhealthy for the organism, whether the mother or a child, aside from pregnancy completely, even for a male. So that's what these unsaturated fats do. Two major roles. One, pro-inflammatory. Two, they work like some of those stress hormones that first of all put us under stress, and second of all, over time are known to powerfully inhibit metabolic production of energy.
Wow. Okay, so quick before we leave, maybe if a pregnant woman or a young family or really anyone wanted to make a quick list of foods to probably avoid because they might be high in this polyunsaturated fat that seems to wreak havoc on metabolism. I mean, what would that list maybe consist of off the top of your head?
So I would fully avoid cold water fatty fish such as salmon, mackerel, anything that's caught in cold water and it has a significant amount of fat. So for example, trout is a cold water fish, but it's a cold freshwater fish and typically doesn't have a lot of fat on it. It tends to be a lean fish. So well cooked will have probably, especially if it's grilled, most of the fat will probably have already drained away. And if you peel off the skin, it happens to make for a very good lean fish. But things like fatty fishes from cold water, especially saltwater, cold water, are to be avoided. But seafood in general is good. So things like shrimp, oysters, squid, calamari, more warm water fish, or at least lean cold water fish, such as cod, is great. And then tuna, if it's lean, it could be also good. In general, seafood is great as long as you avoid the fats. And if there is fat, then make sure you're getting fish from or at least the animal from warmer tropical regions, because the warmer the climate, the more saturated the fat inside the animal is. And then in terms of avoiding other sources of polyunsaturated fat, is avoid seed oils. Anything that has corn oil, canola oil, cottonseed oil. All of these oils are actually waste products of specific industries, either agricultural or like textiles, such as the cottonseed. And about 80 years ago, these industries were like trying to figure out a way to get rid of these oils, and they found out that not only they can get rid of them, but they can also make a profit by selling them as food items. And initially, they were sold as food items for the livestock industry, because farmers found out that they can make their animals really fat and really heavy if they feed them even a tiny amount of those seed oils. And the reason this happens is that these oils powerfully inhibit your ability to synthesize energy and promote the synthesis of fat. So that's a great thing for a livestock animal. It's not a great thing for us. So I think you immediately see. So you should be able to replace these fats with butter, with olive oil, with coconut oil, and with fat from ruminant animals and from dairy. Dairy contains mostly saturated fat. Ruminant animals such as beef, lamb, goat meat would be great. Chicken would be fine, but just take off the skin, make sure it's lean meat. In general, if you're eating foods and you're not sure about the fat in the food, it's better if you can remove it as much as possible.
Awesome. And you talked about the seed oils. I mean, it sounds like to me that's every packaged or bagged item at the grocery store, like chips or cracker. And aren't they all made with seed
Absolutely.
oils?
Pretty much all of them, and even if the label doesn't say it, you will often be able to tell by the label because they have to do a breakdown of the fats.
Hmm.
So they used to only say total amount of fat, but these days many of them actually have a breakdown of polyunsaturated and saturated fat. So you want to get an item that has a mostly saturated fat and as little as possible as unsaturated fat. Some of them are sneaky and diabolical. They'll only do total fat and saturated fat. And if that's the case, then make sure you're getting food that has the proportion, the ratio of saturated fat to the total fat is at least 50% or higher. Because if it's lower, chances are the item contains something that's not listed on the label, but it's probably something cheap, and it's usually the cheapest are the seed oils.
Got it. Awesome. Well, Georgie, I think I could probably talk to you forever. I really appreciate you spending this time with me and with any of our listeners. I think we probably both gotta run and get to other things.
That's
Uh,
right. That's right. We both
yeah,
got families, and yours is probably getting antsy, saying like, "What are you doing in that room for hours?"
I just
So yeah,
yeah
I
the
got.
door the door just opened. My wife peeked in, so I think it's I saw my boy running
It's
around in the backyard. So
it's a sign that it's a sign that it's time to go, right?
yeah, it's
Yeah,
time to go play.
that's right.
All right. Well, okay. So thanks. I'll end this chat and look forward to hearing how people receive the video chat here.
Excellent. Let me know.
Awesome. Yeah. Thank you for your time.
All right, man. Thank you.
See ya.
Appreciate it.
Bye.